Hi, this is Dominic Pace, who plays Gekko the Bounty Hunter from The Mandalorian, and you are listening to Star Wars Comics in Canon.
Hello there and welcome to Star Wars Comics in Canon, your guide to the wider Star Wars canon through the comic book lens. And to take you on this journey, I'm your host, Mike Burton. And so brings episode 52. So then guys, this week I am tackling the Age of Resistance Villains one-shot comics. So there's been a batch of Age of comics released and I'm on the last hurdle now. In 4 weeks time I'll have done the last ones. So there's Age of Republic, which is prequels, Age of Rebellion, which is the original trilogy, and then Age of Resistance, which is the sequel trilogy. So this one is a little bit different because there's not really many villains in the sequel trilogy, it seems. So there's only 4 stories, whereas with all the other times there's been 4 stories of heroes, 4 stories of villains, and then 3 mini stories that are kind of a mix in the Age of Special. But the Age of Special for the Age of Resistance is, I think, Rose Tuco, Maz Kanata and BB-8, so they're all heroes in that regard. So this one's going to be a little bit shorter, and then in 4 weeks time when I do the Age of Resistance heroes, that'll be a little bit longer. So for clarity, each of these stories is a one-shot, so it's just a one-off comic about each individual character. Now, these 4 is Captain Phasma, General Hux, Supreme Leader Snoke, and Kylo Ren, although 3 of them have Kylo Ren in them, and the Snoke one is not really about Snoke. They just couldn't really give any information about Snoke due to his mystery of who he was, so it basically is just another Kylo Ren story. But that's okay, because in my opinion, we don't have enough Kylo Ren content, so this is basically one Phasma story and then 3 stories featuring Kylo Ren. Just in case you guys want to check out all of the other Age of Republic and Rebellion stories, episode 2, I think I did Darth Maul, which was not just his Age of, but also all of his stuff. Episode 26, I did like a bio about Count Dooku. Then episodes 31, 35, 39, 43, and 47, they're all just sort of collections. I think 31 and 35 are the remainder of the Age of Republic stuff, and then 39, 43, and 47, I think are the Age of Rebellion things. You have to go back and double check that because there's a couple of crossovers a little bit, but essentially after this I'll only have the Age of Resistance Heroes collection to do, and then I've done all of the Age of comics until inevitably in probably, 5-10 years time they do an Age of High Republic, and then I'll be back on that wagon. But until then, it's just these. So to clarify, all of these comics take place between 29 ABY and 34 ABY. Now, 34 ABY is 34 years after the Battle of Yavin. 34 ABY, that is when the Force Awakens is set. So I think the First Order were sort of around a lot more, about 5 years before the Force Awakens, it seems. Except the only one, which is the Snoke one, it could be 28 ABY instead of 29. So, vagueness around the sequels, which is something I think we're all used to. So the writer for all of these is Tom Taylor, the penciler is Leonard Kirk, the inker is Cory Hamscher, and the colour artist is Guru EFX. The first release was Captain Phasma, that was out July 2019. The final release was the Kylo Ren comic, which was September 2019. The trade paperback collection, which is what I have, which you'll see photos of on Instagram, and my Patreons would have already seen photos of that. That's the trade paperback collection, was December 2019. And then the hardcover collection, which features all of the hero stories and all of the villain stories, that was released in September 2020. Now, to clarify, although each of these are just one-shots and don't really give a huge amount of character information, obviously I'm going to do what I normally do, which is go through each story, give you guys the narrative and any connective tissue. There is next to no connective tissue in all of these. There's a few little bits and pieces, but generally speaking, they're all quite sort of isolated stories. And also, I've said before that the Age of series, to me, seems kind of like an advert for other stuff, because as I've cited before, like in especially the Age of Rebellion era, the one-shots, each character bar Luke has their own mini-series as well, and a lot of them have their own books too. So like the one-off about Han Solo is alright, but there's a Han Solo mini-series which is just a bit better, and obviously those characters are quite fleshed out as well. And in obviously Age of Republic, you've got, there's books and comics about Obi-Wan and Anakin, or books featuring them, as well as, there's the upcoming Kenobi series, and obviously Clone Wars is very Anakin and Obi-Wan heavy. Yoda's a bit here and there everywhere, but then with the Age of Resistance, the Resistance TV show only has Poe in it, and he's in it not very much. I'm almost at the end of series 2, and he's been in like 3 or 4 episodes, I guess. I think he's right at the start, and then he just pops up every now and then. But no one else has been, because obviously from The Force Awakens to the end of Rise of Skywalker, it's like a year. So everything happening in the sequel trilogy happens in a year, whereas with the prequels, everything happens over the course of about 13, 14 years, and in the original trilogy, it all happens over about 4 years. So obviously, there's just nowhere near the amount of availability for content, and the Age of Resistance series isn't as good as Rebels or Clone Wars anyway. But aside from that, basically, as I was saying, the Age of stuff, they're basically adverts for other things, and one of the big parts of the sequels is the Phasma book. Now, the Phasma book, it's basically the backstory of General Hux and also Captain Phasma. Although I will say there is a tiny bit of story about Hux in the Aftermath trilogy of books by Chuck Wendig. Snoke, obviously, everyone who's seen Rise of Skywalker knows that Snoke's character is just bland. And then Kylo Ren is very interesting, but obviously he's like the main character in the sequels apart from Rey. I think they're both sort of the main character. So I want to say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the information about the Phasma book, and then I'm going to give you the information about the Hux book, and either between them or after Hux, I'm then going to go into information about their sort of backstories and how they're interwoven and things. I'm not going to sit here and just do a massive read through of the Phasma book, but I did tackle a backstory of Phasma a little while ago. So for clarity, if you go all the way back to episode 5 of Star Wars Comics in Canon, I actually tackle the Captain Phasma miniseries. And that whole miniseries is basically just filling in a plot hole of how did she survive after The Force Awakens to The Last Jedi, and how come she wasn't like reprimanded for basically lowering the shields of Starkiller and getting basically everyone who was on there who died. It's her fault. And obviously if Han and Finn hadn't caught her and made her lower the shields, then the First Order probably would have succeeded with Starkiller Base and the other films wouldn't have happened. So it does give information about that, and in that episode I do go into depth about the relationship between Captain Phasma and General Hux and that sort of thing. So I'm not going to say everything I said in that episode, but I am going to go back and give you a little bit of information, because obviously that was 40 odd episodes ago. So that was almost a year ago now. That's quite mental. And also with the Kylo Ren comic, the first episode of Star Wars Comics in Canon I did, apart from the sort of introductory episode, was actually The Rise of Kylo Ren. So if you go back to the first episode of Star Wars Comics in Canon, that was actually, I did the miniseries, and it's really interesting. You actually get to see how Kylo Ren bled his lightsaber crystal, why it's cracked. You get a bit more information about what happened after the events of The Last Jedi, when it's got the flashbacks and, Luke ignited his lightsaber over a sleeping Ben Solo, and then, Ben collapsed the hut on him and then went on what seemed to be a rampage, and then the Jedi Temple was on fire. You actually get to see what caused all that sort of thing and how he interacted with some of the other students and things. It's a really, really good miniseries, The Rise of Kylo Ren. It's actually one of my favourites. So I would say go back and listen to episode 1 and also listen to episode 5 of Star Wars Comics in Canon, and then you get a lot more information about these characters. I also want to note that the artwork in all of these comics is really cool, and there's some really, really interesting panels. I have taken photos of a couple of them. They'll be on social media and they're already up for any Patreons, but I just want to flag that as well, because, I do always want to say to people, I do encourage you after listening to this to go and read the comics, or read the comics and then listen to this to kind of get the connective tissue and stuff like that. I know some of you listeners like to listen to this and then see if you fancy reading a comic afterwards, and I know other ones are trying to read through all the Star Wars comics and then listen to these episodes after you've read them. Completely fine, however you want to do it. But I would say, this one is probably one of the best Age of series that I've read, these villains ones, but that's, as I said, mainly because it focuses a lot on Kylo Ren, and he's one of my favourite characters in Star Wars, and also the Resistance characters don't have much backstory or much flushing out, really, apart from arguably Phasma, because there's just not been enough content around the sequel trilogy, because obviously it's only been in existence for a little while. Now, granted, the canon's been around since, the new canon since 2014, but with Clone Wars and Rebels and other bits and pieces as well, and the original films and stuff, there's just a lot more information about the characters in the other Age of stuff. So, getting on to the Phasma one. So, this is Captain Phasma, and the story is called Fallen Guns. So, I'm going to read the little crawl. The New Republic maintains peace and order after the fall of the Empire, but the evil First Order, modelled after the old regime, rises from its ashes, and with an untold number of powerful war machines and legions of dogmatic stormtroopers at its disposal, the First Order stands poised to seize control of the galaxy, and one ruthless stormtrooper could be the weapon of war that leads the final order to total victory. So these comics, they're fairly short, so it's not going to be me talking about the narrative too long, so it's going to be sort of a little bit. So, it starts off in the unknown regions. There's a monologue by a character called KM8713, and I'm just going to call them KM because that's the stormtrooper or the First Order stormtrooper sort of call signs and things, what people are assigned. For clarity, Finn was called FN2187, so it's like 2 letters and then dash, then 4 numbers usually. But yeah, this main character is KM8713, and it shows that Phasma is leading the troops. There's like a monologue going on that I'm not going to read, but it's basically from the perspective of KM. Phasma gives out this big speech, and then there's it's a war zone and things, a lot of shooting going on, and the enemy's ship sort of comes down and starts to charge up this big purple beam thing. An explosion happens, and lots and lots of people are wounded, and KM carries a friend of theirs because they're wounded, and Phasma says to leave him. While KM is carrying her friend and Phasma's turned around to sort of reprimand KM, KM then shoots someone who's behind Phasma who would have shot Phasma instead, saying, "Might out of the way," and that sort of thing, and shoots them. As she kills the thing that's behind Phasma, it's just a native of a planet that's not really anywhere else. As this native dies, it drops a thermal detonator, which is basically, the shiny grey hand grenades of the Star Wars universe. And as she drops it, Phasma grabs the friend of KM, who's called DB, throws the friend, who's still alive, onto the thermal detonator, and so his body takes up the explosion, which is very, very brutal. But if you know anything about Phasma, in or outside of the films, you know that she is one badass woman who is not afraid to do anything it takes to survive, and this comic reinforces that. Phasma then tells KM to pull out and regroup, and that she will speak to her later in her quarters. So it cuts to later, and KM walks into Phasma's quarters, and Phasma sat there without her helmet on, and gets KM to take her helmet off too. Phasma says to KM that KM may have saved her life, but only because she was distracted by KM carrying her friend and not doing what she should have done. If she'd have just left her friend there, Phasma would never have turned around, and therefore KM would have never saved her life. Phasma also notes that compassion is actually a weakness, and uses examples saying, can you save everyone? And KM's like, no. And she says, so don't save anyone. There's no point. The way you get through this is you survive. What's your ambition? And she says she wants to lead like Phasma does. And she says, okay, hold on to that ambition. That's a good thing. But you can't lead if you're constantly turning around trying to save everyone behind you. You have to lead, and sacrifices must be made. After KM says that she wants to lead and kind of takes on board what Phasma says, Phasma then promotes her to an officer. Phasma then says that they're going to strike again, they need to strike the enemies, and they need to take their base. They wouldn't need to take it by a foot if it didn't have some sort of strategic importance to them. Otherwise, the First Order would just bomb it from space. So Phasma is putting KM at the front lines, in charge of all these stormtroopers, and saying that you can take this base. So the next day, KM charges with her troops and things, and then the enemy brings out some walkers and things. There's some sort of ships that we haven't seen before, but they look quite cool, and they come out and just start destroying the stormtroopers. The stormtroopers' blasters aren't penetrating any of the armor and things, and KM is just watching her people get massacred. She sees Phasma's walking away and turns around and follows, and as she's kind of asking what Phasma's doing, Phasma's just saying, go back to the battlefield. And then KM hears a noise, quite a familiar one, and then looks up and sees there are TIE fighters flying over, like a lot of them. The TIE fighters then shoot the area where all of the stormtroopers are, as well as all of the enemy walkers and whatnot, and it basically kills everyone there and destroys all of the enemy's vehicles. KM is obviously very angry about this and basically says to Phasma that she's going to tell everyone that she's a traitor, and gets very, very angry and then shoots her in the chest. Phasma doesn't even really flinch and just keeps walking towards her, saying her own armor is worth more than KM's life. They have a tussle and they sort of roll around and things while Phasma's basically explaining to KM that she's basically weak and Phasma needs to be able to do anything to survive, and that includes what just happened. And after that little tussle, Phasma then shoots KM in the chest, she collapses onto the floor, and then Phasma leaves, and that is the end of that story. So anytime you read any Phasma material, and it includes in the Phasma miniseries I mentioned that I tackled ages ago on the podcast, episode 5 I think I said, Phasma is someone who will do anything to survive. So when you see in The Force Awakens and you see a character who's willing to put down the shields around Starkiller, you think, God, well, she's quite high up, why would she do something like that? It's all about self-preservation for Phasma. The book goes into a lot of detail about that. I'm pretty certain that Phasma, I think she betrays her own brother just to get off the planet that she's on. There's all kinds of stuff, but Phasma will do literally anything it takes to survive, and that's how her character works. And I think it shows really well in this comic. It's also worth mentioning that Phasma's armour, which is obviously that chrome, is actually made from the material of one of Palpatine's old pleasure yachts. So I believe, essentially, when you see, obviously Palpatine is originally from Naboo. Now, when you see in episode 1, and I think in episode 2, you see a couple of Naboo starships that are very, very chrome and reflective. They just look like flying mirrors, essentially. It seems like Phasma got her armour from one of those that was owned by Palpatine, which is really, really cool. To have your armour made of that sort of thing is cool. And obviously it explains why it's blaster proof, because if you have a ship that needs to go through space, it's going to be resistant to blasters. So I just thought that was a fun little tidbit. So there's a bit more information about Hux and also mainly Phasma. So Phasma was the leader of the Skya Warriors on a planet called Parnassus. Brendel Hux, which is Armitage Hux's dad. So General Hux's first name is Armitage, in case you weren't aware of that. But Armitage Hux's dad, Brendel Hux, which is part of the Imperial Remnant. So in the Aftermath trilogy, it basically shows that Brendel Hux was a part of the last officers in the Empire, and then when they lost the Battle of Jakku, a bunch of them shot off into the unknown regions to rebuild, and that's what created the First Order. And Brendel Hux was one of those people, and Armitage, at the age of I think 6 or 7, is actually in the Aftermath books as well. So Brendel Hux crash lands, I think, on the planet that Phasma's on. They have some vague amount of alliance. Phasma basically abandons her family, her clan, her brother, and then eventually becomes in charge of stormtrooper training. And then Armitage Hux and Phasma both conspire together to kill Brendel Hux, because Brendel Hux, Armitage's dad, was very abusive to Armitage, and Armitage doesn't like anyone being stronger than him, or better than him, or basically ridiculing him in any way, which is why, in the sequel trilogy as well, he's at a certain point, he's very ready to kill Kylo Ren. One of my favourite moments is in The Last Jedi when Hux walks into the room after Kylo and Rey just tried to, use the Force on Anakin's lightsaber. It ripped in half, and then Kylo Ren's on the floor. And when Hux walks over to Kylo Ren, he slowly reaches for his blaster, and then as soon as Kylo Ren moves, he immediately moves out of the way. So obviously he looks like he was going to shoot a passed out Kylo Ren, because, Armitage is not past doing that sort of thing. But yeah, so basically, Armitage's dad found Phasma. She was already a warrior and things and was desperate to get off that planet because I think it was ravaged. It was almost like post-apocalyptic, essentially. It was very harsh conditions and things. There was not really anything there. So she goes off with Brendel to help with the Imperial Remnant to become what the First Order would be, and then teams up with Armitage, and basically, I think they poison them with some sort of beetle or something along those lines, and that basically kills Brendel Hux. So Armitage killed his own dad with the help of Phasma, and Phasma did it for self-preservation, and obviously that's one of the reasons why Hux keeps her around and why she's so high up as well. It does help. Obviously she's a really good warrior too, but that's a bit of backstory. That is the insanely short footnotes version of the Phasma book. So if you want to hear more about that sort of stuff, go check out the Phasma book. So leading on from all that backstory about Phasma and Hux, here is the next issue of Age of Resistance Villains. So this is about General Hux, or Armitage, however you want to address him, and this story is called Marooned, and here's the crawl. Ruthless General Armitage Hux is one of the First Order's most dangerous and trusted leaders, third only to Kylo Ren and the Supreme Leader himself. What made Hux the man he is today? Ambition, or something far more sinister? Now, I would say going into this one, this is one of my favourites of the 4. It's kind of hard to tell. I mean, the Phasma one is good, but it's quite plain, and if you already know about Phasma, it doesn't really add anything. Whereas this one, I think, just adds another layer to the relationship between Kylo Ren and General Hux. So here is the story. So it starts off with years ago, a little flashback. It's got Hux as a boy, and he drops a glass in front of someone called Admiral Brooks, and his father's there as well. His father is only a commandant at that time. His father calls him useless, and Brooks tells Hux to lick the drink off the floor. So Hux is kind of looking scared and unsure of himself. He goes down to lick the drink off the floor, and then his dad has a massive go at him. And it basically just shows that his dad didn't value him at all, and this Admiral Brooks character didn't treat him any better either. So then it cuts to now, and it's got Kylo Ren waking up Hux. They're on a ship, and they're quite badly injured. There's fire everywhere. Hux is actually bleeding from his head, and it turns out that the hyperdrive was off, the engine's failing, there's no communications or anything, and they're basically being pulled into another planet via its gravity. So the ship they're on crash lands, and Ren actually saves both himself and also Hux. This is one of the panels I took a photo of because it's quite cool, and there's quite a good interaction between them. Hux is like, you saved me, why? And Ren was like, I didn't do it intentionally, I saved myself and you were just nearby. So it's got a really cool panel where there's just wreckage everywhere, and Ren is standing there with his hand out, and there's just sort of wreckage all around him in sort of a ball shape, and Hux is on the floor in front of him. So I thought that's just another good tell of their relationship, where Ren would actively want to kill Hux, which does go into this a little bit in the story, but he doesn't because of Snoke, and also because sometimes it's more convenient to not kill the person rather than to kill them. Ren and Hux then have an exchange, and they basically agree that the ship must have been sabotaged, and they have a little argument over who would sabotage it and why, and I'm just going to read their exchange because it's quite a cool one. So it starts with Ren. Communications are out. And then Hux. Which means I have no choice but to talk to you instead of literally anyone else. How did this happen? Where's the pilot? Over there, and a little bit over there. The way we dropped out of hyperspace, the way we came down, the communications going out first, losing control so close to a planet's orbit. I know, shuttles don't just fail like this, it was clearly sabotage. Someone in your army tried to kill you. Clearly you've managed to inspire a lot of loyalty, Hux. Oh please, I thought you could read minds, Ren. You honestly believe people hate me more than they hate you, with your petulant tantrums and your... And my what? Vader wore his mask because he couldn't breathe without it, but you just play dress up to hide the faces of your rebel scum parents. And Kylo Ren's lightsaber ignites. It would take the First Order an age to search every point of our hyperspace path. No one knows where we are. No one would miss you. No one would know. Snoke would know. He'll find it in your head somewhere. He'll punish you. And Ren deactivates his lightsaber. I don't understand why Snoke keeps you around. Of course you don't. We have to find a way to get a message off this planet. We have to let the First Order know where we are. And how do you propose we do that? We're all alone. And then a chunk of meat falls near them. While they're trying to figure out what it is, Hux realises it's bait, and this giant monster runs out of the forest right at them. So I've stopped reading the exact dialogue now, and this monster, it's blue, it's completely furry, and it looks like a cross between a bear, a gorilla, and maybe like the head of a saber-toothed tiger sort of thing, and it's massive. It's pretty scary, it runs straight towards them. Ren ignites his lightsaber, tells Hux to stay behind him, and Hux just runs away. The creature gets closer to Ren, and Ren snaps the neck of the creature using the Force, and then two more attack Ren. One of the creatures smashes Ren in the face, knocking his helmet off and knocking him out. An old man emerges from the forest and claims to have tamed the creatures. It turns out that he's an old Iranian, and he's actually a palace guard, so he went off-world when the war all started to happen, and his name is... It's either Bylsma or Bylsma. It's Bylsma. I think it's Bylsma. And Hux tells Bylsma that the war is actually over between the galactic civil war between the Empire and the Rebellion. He points out that, the Empire fell because of the arrogance of the Emperor and all that sort of stuff. And he points out that Ren is actually the son of Leia and Han Solo, obviously the rebel leaders. Bylsma didn't actually even know about the Death Star 2 either. He knew about the Death Star. He asked if it had been destroyed, and obviously it had been. So he didn't know about the Death Star 2. So he's been there for... probably since, if he knew about the Death Star, it would give him quite a slim time, really, because they knew about the Death Star in sort of Rogue One time, and then it was only, I think a few days, maybe, at a stretch, maybe a week or so, between knowing about the existence of the Death Star and it getting blown up. So it's quite an interesting, I'm not really sure where he fits in there, but that would mean that he's been there since, 0 ABY or even 0 BBY, the Battle of Yavin, he was there around that time, and at this point in the story, it could be 29 years after that, or even up to 34 years after that. So he's been on that planet for around 30 years, which is quite intense. Bylsma confirms that he didn't actually send any communication out or anything because he was scared of getting found, and he said he already lost one world because he was a palace guard on Alderaan. He was off-world when it got blown up, and then basically put himself into exile. So Hux and Bylsma continue to talk and things. Hux is confirming sort of what happened in the war and whatnot, and Hux is specifically not revealing that they're part of the First Order or their, ties to the Empire. Kylo then awakens, but Hux calls him Ben, Ben Solo, and then Hux thanks Bylsma, and Phasma lands in a ship with lots of stormtroopers. The stormtroopers shoot this man's creatures, destroy the comms, and leave him there again. And Hux specifically says, we'll leave him here, and then we'll test Starkiller Base on this planet because it will amuse me. Which just goes to show how much of a complete psychopath General Hux is. They then go back onto the ship, and Hux has identified who the saboteur is. He speaks to Snoke with Kylo Ren around and says he wants to deal with it because Kylo Ren normally is quite messy with that sort of thing, and Snoke lets him. Hux then leaves the presence. I mean, it's actually like Snoke is in the sort of hologram form, sort of like you see him in The Force Awakens, and Ren and Hux are there in person seeing this big hologram sit on a giant throne thing. And Hux, when he leaves the room to go and deal with this saboteur, Kylo Ren and Snoke have a discussion. So I'm going to read that out now. So it starts with Kylo Ren. I do not see his worth, Supreme Leader. You do not need to. He is not to be trusted. You must know his mind. He wants to take your place. He wants to kill you. He wants to kill a lot of people. I don't take it personally. Men like Hux are useful. Men consumed with ambition, fueled by spite. Men who can set aside their pride, who have shame burning inside of them. Pups who are abused often grow to be vicious creatures, but they never forget where they came from, and they never forgive. So while that sort of monologue goes on, especially the part where Snoke is talking about Hux, it shows what Hux does. So Hux approaches Admiral Brooks, and Phasma's with him, and Brooks comments on the saboteur being found as some sort of technician of some sort, and Hux is like, well, he was under your command, so I'm holding you responsible. He gets Phasma to take away any weapons that Brooks has, and takes Phasma's gun, which is quite hefty. He tells Brooks to take a seat, and Phasma leaves them, and he holds the gun to Brooks, and Brooks is like, you can't be serious. Brooks then has a go at him and says, you just needed an excuse to kill me, you were spineless as you were as a child, you know how little your father thought of you, and then Hux is like, I do, it's one of the reasons that I killed him. You see the shock on Brooks' face, and then Hux shoots him in the shoulder. As Brooks is on the floor, sort of begging, Hux walks up to him, aiming the gun at him, and says, the thing is, I'm not weak, I'm patient. You all have the power to destroy people. My father, Snoke, Ren, you all underestimate me. But I'll outlive all of you and hold more power than any of you. Destroying people is nothing. I have the power to destroy worlds, but you won't get to see any of that. Then he shoots Brooks, and that is the end of the comic. So I know in that one I read out quite a lot of dialogue, which I don't generally do in these comics because I do want people to read them, but I just thought if I didn't and I tried to paraphrase, it wouldn't have the same impact. But once again, you know, Hux is quite an interesting character, and I did actually really like him in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, but yeah, he just flopped in Rise of Skywalker. But, you know, this version in the Age of Resistance comics, it reinforces his personality in those first two films. And just before I move on to the next comic, which is going to be the Snoke comic, I just want to comment that one of my favourite moments in all of Star Wars, especially in the sequel trilogy, but generally in all of Star Wars, is that moment in The Force Awakens when you've got Hux standing there with all the stormtroopers and he's yelling at them and things and preparing for Starkiller Base to fire. And those words that he says, which, this is the last day of the Republic, and then the beam shoots out. The acting in that is incredible, and the passion and the imagery, obviously it being parallel to sort of the Nazis and things with both the colours and also the imagery, the salutes and everything. It just works together so well, and just, yeah, that moment I think is a real highlight of Domhnall Gleeson's acting. He is brilliant in everything I've seen him in, so that's a bit of fun. And also a side note is that although Armitage Hux's dad, Brendel, is only seen, I think, in this comic very briefly, and then he's only sort of referenced in other places, what a lot of fans like to do is actually use photos of Domhnall Gleeson's dad as a sort of placeholder for Brendel Hux. So Domhnall Gleeson's dad is actually Brendan Gleeson. Now, you may know him from, if you've seen Harry Potter, he plays Mad-Eye Moody. He also is in Bruges. There's only like 5 people in Bruges, like Ralph Fiennes and Colin Farrell are the other 2 people. I don't want to spoil what happens in Bruges to his character, but if you've seen Bruges, you know what happens to his character. But he's a really good actor, and obviously his son, Domhnall Gleeson's a really good actor too. But it is just one of those funny things where, yeah, fans basically get photos of Domhnall Gleeson, the actor, use his dad's photos, Brendan Gleeson, as a placeholder for Brendel Hux, because, yeah, as I said, there's no live action version of Brendel Hux at present, and the only time you really get to see him is in this comic, and everything else I think is just in written literature, so I just thought that was a fun little tidbit. So next up is the Snoke comic. Now I preface this at the start saying, really, this isn't a Snoke comic, this is just another Kylo Ren comic, because as I've said before, although I enjoy what they did with Snoke in Force Awakens and especially in The Last Jedi, I do not really like what they did with him in Rise of Skywalker, another plot point that I wasn't a massive fan of, but still, because all the Star Wars creators weren't really told anything about Snoke, and in my opinion, I don't really think even the heads at Star Wars really knew what they were doing with Snoke after The Last Jedi, all of the information about him is really limited. So this one, they couldn't go into his backstory or anything like that because obviously Rise of Skywalker kind of answered that question. So this is really all about Ren. And it is a really cool story. I do enjoy it, but I'm going to read it to you. So the name of it is Fail or Kill It, and the crawl is: from the ashes of the evil galactic empire rises the First Order, a villainous sect of the fanatics united by their supreme leader Snoke. With a promising new apprentice and the limitless power of the dark side of the Force to command, Snoke is poised to crush the New Republic and take over the galaxy. So out of the 4 comics, I would say this one and the Kylo Ren ones are probably the ones most worth reading, even if you listen to me talk about them and things, because the artistry in all 4 of these comics is genuinely excellent, but the imagery in this comic and especially in the next one are just really good. And if anyone's got like Marvel Unlimited or something, or, has an extra tenner to buy the trade paperback, I would recommend it just to read these because they are quite cool, especially if you're a fan of Kylo Ren. Also, for clarity, Snoke is in the Rise of Kylo Ren comic as well, and then he's in, I think, briefly mentioned in certain other comics and whatnot, but he's not really anywhere apart from the movies hugely. And according to online, apparently he was unaware of his own true nature, which is what's in Rise of Skywalker, which I won't spoil for people just in case they still haven't seen it. He was apparently born maybe 4 years after the Battle of Yavin, or potentially even later. So he was born around the era of Return of the Jedi, allegedly, which means he would be around 30 at the time of the Rise of Skywalker and Last Jedi. So, once again, weirdness. But aside from that, the other little interesting bit about Snoke is that he actually wears an obsidian ring. And I think you can see it in The Last Jedi and you can see it in this comic. And it's actually made from pieces of obsidian from a Sith cave, which is actually underneath Fortress Vader on Mustafar. Now, if you don't know what Fortress Vader is, Fortress Vader, he basically, you can see it in Rogue One, I believe, because I think Krennic goes there. And obviously, Darth Vader became the Darth Vader everyone kind of knows in the suit due to the battle on Mustafar with Obi-Wan and Anakin. And in the Darth Vader comics, the 2017 run, which is the second run, written by Charles Soule, also called Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith, that goes into details of his own building of Fortress Vader. It is an absolutely excellent story, and it is going to be the next big series I'm going to be tackling. Once I've done these Age of Resistance comics, and also when I've done doing the Kanan comics, then it will generally be probably 3 weeks of the month will be ongoing series, and then one might be, some of the new stuff that's going on. I'll probably kind of vary a little bit, but the next series I'm going to be tackling is going to be the Darth Vader comics, which I am very excited for because the Charles Soule Darth Vader comics are probably some of the best comics I've ever read. So very excited about that. So if you want to get ahead of me, explaining the story and whatnot of the Vader comics, go check that out. I think Fortress Vader is the final arc, and there's about 25 issues in total. I think the Fortress Vader arc's like the last 7. So yeah, I would recommend that. Anyway, on to the narrative. So from what I gather, this seems to be semi-early on in Ren's training. If I had to guess, I would say this takes place within a year or so after the Rise of Kylo Ren comic, which is probably, about a year or so after Ren has the whole stuff in the Jedi Temple and has the confrontation with Luke that is shown in the flashbacks in The Last Jedi. That's how much I gather. I think it's about a year from there, but once again, it's quite ambiguous. So, Snoke is holding Ren over this pit, as in using the Force, so Ren is basically just floating in the air. He drops him, and then Ren uses the Force to survive, to stop himself before he hits the ground and not die. Snoke is training Ren at this time. They're on some planet that isn't really mentioned elsewhere, and Snoke says he needs to take Ren somewhere to do the next phase of his training. He mentions that there's something holding Kylo Ren back, and he says that you will either fail or you will kill it. So they get to the place they need to go, which is Dagobah. I mean, I didn't really hide that very well because I think I put it in the title of this episode, but they go to Dagobah, which is obviously where Yoda was in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and they specifically go to the Dark Side Cave, which is there, which is where Luke has his Force vision. Now, just before getting off the ship and things, Ren goes to grab his helmet, and Snoke slaps him across the face and has a go at him. He says, "Leave it. You cannot hide behind a mask, pretending to be Vader." It's one of those weird things in the series where obviously Ren had it in The Force Awakens, and then he takes his helmet off, or rather breaks it, because Snoke has a go at him for it and semi-ridicules him. And then in Rise of Skywalker, they just bring it back. And it does look cool in The Rise of Skywalker, but once again, it's just a disjointed sequel trilogy. But when they're on Dagobah and things, Kylo mentions that he can actually feel the presence of Luke Skywalker from his time he was there. Snoke mentions that he respects Luke, and Ren asks why. Snoke says that he respects and fears him, and Kylo Ren's like, well, why? He's weak. And Snoke is like, Luke Skywalker is definitely not weak. He is misguided. And if Luke had teamed up with Snoke, then the galaxy would have been Snoke's by now, because Luke is a very powerful person to have on your side. So they head to the cave, as I said, from The Empire Strikes Back. You see Luke go into the cave and he fights off against Vader, and then, he takes his weapon in, which Yoda says he shouldn't do. He kills this vision of Vader, and then Vader's helmet explodes off, and it reveals to be Luke's face underneath it. There's a lot of interpretation to that, but I think the general theory is that if Luke is using aggression and wants to kill Vader, he will then in turn become Vader, which obviously, when you see that in Empire Strikes Back, it didn't really make a lot of sense. But when you then watch Return of the Jedi, it does actually make a bit of sense, even though that whole cave scene is still a bit sort of ambiguous and weird, but, it's a cool scene. So inside the cave, Ren feels cold and death and more. Ren goes up against a vision of Luke and he kills him. It's some really cool scenes, but I'm kind of skipping over those parts because I'm not going to explain the fight scenes and whatnot, but it is really visually cool. Then Ren mentions that he's finished. Snoke calls out and says that he's not, he's still got a final test, and Ren hears someone calls his name, Ben. He turns around and Leia and Han are there, calling him Ben Solo. He ignites his lightsaber, and then you can see Snoke sort of monologue saying, yes, I can feel you ignite your saber. Now point it at your enemy and get ready to strike them down. Basically very, very similar to his dialogue in The Last Jedi when Kylo Ren is pretending to basically ignite his lightsaber to kill Rey. He's actually igniting the lightsaber next to Snoke to kill Snoke. It's very much clearly being a parallel to that, showing that Ren actually had some sort of idea that he could trick Snoke in that way anyway. Because after Ren ignites his lightsaber, he slices around and is like destroying the inside of the cave. He doesn't attack Leia or Han, even though they're Force visions. So he's destroying the cave all around him and things, and Snoke is thinking that he's killing Han and Leia. This explosion happens and Ren basically blew up the cave. He used something which it looks like something called Force Repulse, which I only know the name of that because it's in the video game that's now Legends, The Force Unleashed. Basically, it's like a force push, but instead of it coming out of sort of your hand in one direction, it comes from like all of you. So it's like a circle of force push coming from out of you, which is quite cool. But he does that, he blows up the cave, and Snoke mentions that the cave stood for thousands of years and that he was planning on bringing his next apprentice there. And Kylo Ren mentions that he won't need another apprentice, and that is where that comic ends. So it's one of those comics where I did kind of skate over the details. It is basically really cool to read. It's a fun comic, especially, Ren going to the cave on Dagobah. That is fun. But as I said, there's basically nothing about Snoke in there, except a couple of parallels to how Ren defeats Snoke in Last Jedi. Which means that we are moving on to the final comic, which is the Kylo Ren comic. So a few pieces of information about Ren. Obviously, birth name Ben Solo. He was actually born on 5 years after the Battle of Yavin, so 1 year after Return of the Jedi. He was born on a planet called Chandrila, and that is where I believe Mon Mothma comes from. I think she's the senator of Chandrila. And also, after the original trilogy, Chandrila, I think, becomes the sort of capital of the New Republic for quite a while. I know that it's mentioned in the Leia Bloodline book, where it's called Bloodline, but it features Leia. I think it's about halfway between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. I think there's about 30 years between them, and I have a feeling that it might be about 10 years after, 10, 15 years after, because I think Ren at the time is still Ben Solo and he's training with Luke at that time. But the Bloodline book is really, really interesting. It's by Claudia Gray and I really recommend it to people. It's quite cool. But in that book as well, it not only mentions that he was born on Chandrila, but funnily enough, he was conceived on Endor. So Han and Leia made Kylo Ren in the forests of Endor, so that's a lot of fun. Also, in the Rise of Kylo Ren comic, it details why Kylo's lightsaber kind of shimmers and stuff and whatnot. It's an unstable lightsaber crystal because Ren, when he bled his lightsaber crystal, which is something I've mentioned numerous times, but basically you get a normal coloured Jedi lightsaber, you hold the crystal in your hand, you put all your horrible anger, fear, suffering, all of the dark side emotions into the crystal. You feed it into there to basically make the crystal bleed, which is what turns it red. But when Kylo Ren does it, he's so conflicted, he actually cracks the crystal when he does that, which is why his lightsaber shimmers. And also he has, the old school sort of crossguard. That is the sort of thing they used to have, I think, in the High Republic days and even prior to that, because the technology needed them to be made in that certain way, because the exhaust I think, system wasn't quite as advanced as it is in present day, but because Ren's lightsaber is so unstable, I think it basically needs to have the crosshairs coming out, which are essentially vents. That's the kind of wishy-washy short way of me explaining it. So with all that in mind, let's get started. So the Kylo Ren comic is called Out of the Shadow, and here's the crawl. The son of smuggler Han Solo and Princess Leia Organa, Ben Solo was once one of the most promising of the new generation of Jedi. That is, until his uncle, Jedi Master Luke Skywalker, sensed the dark side in Ben. Since then, Ben has abandoned the ways of the Jedi. As Kylo Ren of the villainous First Order, he now walks a dark path. Now, this is an Age of Resistance comic that I really recommend people read physically. It's probably got the best visuals of any of these villains comics. There's a lot of imagery and mirroring of Kylo Ren and Darth Vader. It's very clever, and I have taken a photo of a double-page spread which shows this, and it's just some of the best art I've seen in Star Wars comics, and it's just a really clever premise of this one-shot. So it starts off with this gentleman named Captain Rutherford. He's putting on some old Stormtrooper gear, as in from the Galactic Civil War days, not the updated First Order Stormtrooper gear. He is an old soldier, and they're heading to this planet, and it confirms that a tent was put down for negotiation, but forces were also put into place in case the negotiation fails. It turns out that Kylo Ren is on their ship as well. There's a cool panel of him sort of meditating and I think putting his lightsaber together and whatnot. And Rutherford is the only soldier who was alive from the last battle on this planet. And so he was asked to accompany and advise. Ren says where Vader failed, he will succeed. And it's got a lot of imagery where it shows sort of Kylo Ren standing over this plane with lots of stormtroopers behind him. And then the next panel is basically the same, but it's got Vader there and all of the stormtroopers. Their armor is, the old stormtrooper armor. And it's also got Captain Rutherford there with his helmet on with Vader, but with his helmet off when he's with Ren. It's also mentioned that Vader did manage to eventually subdue the locals and whatnot, but the price was thousands of people on both sides. The native species there seem to value size and strength, and Ren wants them to stop expanding. So the person he speaks to in this tent is someone called King Christoph. He's a massive person. Kind of doesn't look that different from the creature I described in the Hux comic, where it's basically, he looks like a giant gorilla thing, but with like tusk teeth coming out of his like sort of underbite, but he's also furry. But instead of being blue, he is yellow, much like all the other locals. And Christoph, when Kylo Ren approaches him and tells him to stop expanding and whatnot because he's taken over, I think, 3 systems nearby, or 3 planets in the nearby system, Christoph says that Vader was more impressive than Ren, and even Vader couldn't stand against their god. Kylo tells him to stop it, and then even tries to use a mind trick on him. The king says that he sounds slower when he's doing that sort of thing. Rutherford makes a comment, and then Kylo Ren ignites his lightsaber into the side of King Christoph's head. So he holds the hilt up to the side, ignites it, and the blade goes right through his brain and out the other side. The 2 guards inside the tent go towards Ren, and Ren slices off one of their legs and the other one's head, which is quite cool. And then battle horns start to go, and then a big battle ensues. Rutherford mentions that it's not a competition with Vader and that negotiations should have been tried a bit harder rather than trying to get this war, but yeah, he mentions to Ren it is not a competition against Vader. Then is this really amazing panel where it's got Ren and Vader simultaneously fighting, the locals, and showing how their styles are similar in certain ways but also different, and that's one of the photos I took of, and it should be on social media by now. Then this beast awakens, and it's something called the Zillo beast. Now, the Zillo beast is actually a main part of a 2-part arc in the Clone Wars series. It's like a King Kong story in the Clone Wars. It's this giant beast. Its skin, or rather its sort of leathery hide, is completely resistant to blaster fire, no matter how big the ship is, or the gun, or anything like that. Lightsabers don't even penetrate it or even make a mark in any way, and I think the Zillo beasts are mentioned a little bit in Legends and whatnot, but generally speaking it seems to be in the Clone Wars series, and that's relatively it. So anyone who's seen that knows what sort of happens in that. I'm not going to tread water and explain what happened in that Clone Wars episode, or the Clone Wars 2-parter, but Palpatine was trying to create some sort of synthetic version or something of the Zillo Beast's hide, because if he could make Stormtrooper, or rather Clone Trooper armor out of the Zillo Beast's hide that was resistant to lightsabers, then that would make them even harder to kill when he eventually did Order 66. So that's quite a cool little thing in the Clone Wars. I think that's in one of the later seasons. I have a feeling it's season 3, 4 or 5, but I might be wrong there. But yeah, if you haven't seen that, it's a really cool episode. So the Zillo Beast awakens, ships shoot at it, soldiers shoot at it, and nothing really works. So Ren gets into a shuttle and then flies at the beast and then jumps out, and the beast eats him. Some of the soldiers are looking around and thinking, basically, what do we do now? Our leader's just been eaten by this giant beast. And then the Zillo beast starts to flail around and it looks like it's in sort of pain, and then it collapses. Then a lightsaber ignites and you see the inside of what seems to be the Zillo beast's neck gets cut open, and Kylo Ren emerges from the inside of the beast. He yells out that your god is dead to all of the natives, and they all kneel to him. Then the final panel is Rutherford saying to Ren, "You know when I said this wasn't a competition? Well, you won the competition." And that is where that ends. Now, once again, that's just the bare bones of the story. There are some really cool dialogue in that, and as I said, the action scenes and the imagery is absolutely excellent in it, and I really recommend it, especially people who've seen the Clone Wars, because you do actually get to see Anakin, I say face off against a Zillo Beast, but try and face a Zillo Beast. So it's quite interesting that Anakin went against a Zillo Beast along with Obi-Wan and I think Ahsoka in the Clone Wars. Then Vader tried to fight one again at some point during the Imperial era, and then Kylo Ren fought against the same one and beat it. Although I will say, this is a really cool comic, and I like that it's trying to show, even though Kylo Ren is kind of trying to be Vader, he's also trying to one-up Vader and prove he's better. It is a really cool story, and I don't know how else they would have done it, but that is a bit of a trope of, oh no, there's a creature and its flesh is impenetrable, how will we defeat it? Well, let's just get someone get swallowed by it and cut it from the inside. And it's like, okay. I mean, I feel like maybe with Kylo Ren what would have been cooler is if he maybe used the Force and crushed the internal organs of the Zillo Beast or something. That would have been quite different and interesting way of doing things, rather than that sort of trope of being eaten, cutting it from the inside, because that happens in almost every monster film, I think, and the MCU movies and all sorts of other stuff. It happens a lot. But aside from that, it's a really cool story, and as I said, the imagery itself is probably the best part of that comic. But that, my friends, is the end of the Age of Resistance Villains one-shot set of comics. So I really hope you guys enjoyed that. As I said, I always recommend people go and read these comics, support the creators, or even just tweet at the creators and tell them that I'm talking about it and you really liked it. That's all a lot of fun. So what we've got coming up over the next few weeks. So next week is going to be the next batch of the main run of Star Wars comics. Oh, I think it's the arc called Hope Dies, if I'm right. I think it's the 50th issue, and it's quite a big one, and there's quite a lot of stuff that happens in that arc, if I'm remembering it correctly. So that's a really interesting one that we'll tackle next week. That'll be episode 53. The week after that is going to be the first half of the Kanan stories. Now, Kanan is a character in Star Wars Rebels. He's one of my all-time favourite characters in all of Star Wars. In Rebels, he is my favourite character, and he's just one of the best Jedi there is. I absolutely love him. If anyone hasn't watched Star Wars Rebels, you need to watch Star Wars Rebels because it's incredible. If anyone has seen Clone Wars, you 1,000,000% need to go watch Star Wars Rebels. If you haven't seen Clone Wars, or you tried Clone Wars, you weren't that into it, that's fine. Try Rebels first. If you're a fan of the original trilogy, Rebels is all on Disney+. There's 4 seasons of it. Each episode's about 20 minutes long, and I think each season has, season 1 has 16 or so episodes, then the rest of them have around 16 to 20, I think. That's what I can vaguely remember. But it has some of the best moments in all of Star Wars. The season 2 finale is some of the best Star Wars I've ever seen in my life, but it makes it better if you've seen the Clone Wars, but it's not essential. If you're a big fan of the original trilogy, you don't really like the prequels very much, and you want to get into more Star Wars content, the animated stuff, I would say you could start with Star Wars Rebels. Then if you really enjoy that, go back to Clone Wars. Because Clone Wars, the problem is, the Clone Wars movie isn't very good. Series 1 is quite bland, apart from 5 episodes. Series 2 is good, but a little bit inconsistent. And then Series 3 onwards is good. Series 4 onwards is genuinely amazing, and basically every episode is good. But because Clone Wars does it a lot in arcs, it just means that you can have 4 episodes that are brilliant arcs, and then the next 4 can just be rubbish. And it's very inconsistent in that way. Whereas Star Wars Rebels doesn't seem to have arcs, it more so has an ongoing storyline, which I personally prefer. And it has a whole new set of characters, which I like as well. And also it does have a lot of people from the original trilogy and stuff sort of pop up, as well as some people from the Clone Wars, which is really, really cool. So if you want more, and obviously Ahsoka's in it as well. So if you want more information about Ahsoka and stuff, but you haven't seen Clone Wars, you can watch Rebels. But yeah, Kanan is a character only in Rebels, and there's a book, I think it's called A New Dawn. It's one of the first new canon Star Wars books. I haven't read it. I think it was out 2014 or 2015, and on the cover you see Kanan and a Twi'lek called Hera Syndulla. So Hera Syndulla, who I've mentioned before, she's currently in the Afra comics at the moment that I'm tackling. She's also in Star Wars Squadrons, and there's a lot of rumours that she's going to be in Rangers of the New Republic instead of Cara Cynthia June. So Hera Syndulla and Kanan, they have a very interesting relationship in Star Wars Rebels. It's really, really good. And so I just love Kanan. I can't stop talking about him. I'm tempted to get a tattoo because he's just one of my my favorite characters. I think he's voiced by, is it Freddie Prinze Jr.? A lot of people know him for his voice acting work, but yeah. Kanan is amazing, and it's going to be 12 issues is the Kanan story, and I'm going to split it into 2 parts, and it's about a Padawan going through Order 66, or surviving it. It's a really, really good comic. So we're tackling that then. The week after that will then be the next batch of Afro comics. The week after that, so 4 weeks from this episode, is going to be the final Age of series, which is the Age of Resistance Heroes. And there's going to be 4 main one-shot comics of that, and then the special, which is going to have 3 mini-stories in there, so it's going to be a bit of a longer one. And then once I've done that, it will mean I've done every single Age of Republic, Rebellion, and Resistance story. So I'll have done all those one-shots, and that will mean I've done every one-shot that is canon in the Marvel run of the Star Wars comics. Then it means that after that, once I've done the Kanan comics and the Age of Resistance comics, I will be tackling the 2017 Vader run, and also I'm going to be tackling some other stuff as well. There's a War of the Bounty Hunters sort of crossover coming up, which is going to be, it's set between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And it's a crossover event between all the current ongoing comics in the current canon. So there's the Bounty Hunter series, which I've tackled Target Vader and Han Solo Imperial Cadet, which both serve as sort of prequels to that. Then there's the next Dr. Aphra series, which is the second run by Alyssa Wong. Then you've got the second run of the main run of Star Wars comics, which is being written by Charles Soule. And then you've got the run, which is the third run of Darth Vader comics, which is written by Greg Pak. So you've got those 4 ongoing series at the moment, and all of them are doing this big crossover event called War of the Bounty Hunters, which I think, from what I can tell, it's going to be basically Boba Fett trying to transport Han Solo to Jabba, but getting interrupted on the way, and lots of other people getting involved too. So that should be a really fun thing, and I think Charles Soule is sort of at the helm of arranging that. So I may end up tackling that as like a special in a few weeks' time. I say a few weeks, I think it's like June it comes out or something. So probably July will be when I tackle that. But as just a general overview of what's going on, I'm going to continue with Afro, going to continue with the main run of Star Wars comics, and then, tackling the second run of Vader comics. I'll probably tackle some degree of the High Republic again. I'm reading The Light of the Jedi at the moment, which is the Claudia Gray novel, so there's going to be more High Republic stuff there. And lots of other bits and pieces as well. But that is generally the forecast for the next while for Star Wars comics in canon. I am going to tackle at some point some of the IDW comics as well. They're generally aimed at a younger audience, but there's a couple of stories called, I think it's Tales from Vader's Castle and Return to Vader's Castle. It's written by Cavan Scott, and they're meant to be sort of anthology horror stories that are self-contained in some ways, that are suitable for all ages, which I haven't read them yet, but I'm quite excited to read those too. So that is enough from me, guys, aside from the usual plugs, which is check out my other show, Genuine Chit-Chat, where I speak to a different guest each episode. I've had almost every member of the Comics in Motion family on, although the family is starting to grow a bit, so I'm having to... there's about 4 or 5 people in Comics in Motion I haven't yet had on Genuine Chit-Chat, so I will be doing that at some point. I've got some people involved with Star Wars that are going to be coming on the show over the next few months as well, so keep an eye out for that. And for non-Star Wars and non-nerdy stuff, I've talked to musicians like Professor Elemental, Iron Tom, Millie Manders and the Shut Up, Shoudo. I've spoken to authors, filmmakers, actors, all kinds of stuff, and I've got other things coming out for that soon too, which is quite exciting. And also I have a Patreon. If you go over to patreon.com/genuinechitchat right now, you get access to 2 episodes completely for free, one of which is mine and Megan's review of The Witcher Series 1, that's about 8 minutes long, and then the other one is of our review of Star Wars The Phantom Menace. We're doing like a whole Star Wars rewatch thing, so we started off with Phantom Menace, and I thought I'd release that for free. I've got quite a few patrons on there now, so if you are a Patreon supporter, I love you, thank you very much. But you can go on there completely for free, don't need to make an account or do anything, you just go over there, the link is in the description, and you can check out basically about 20 minutes, half an hour of content completely for free. And then if you want early access to episodes for Genuine Chit Chat, the odd early episode for Star Wars Comics in Canon, early access to the photos that I take and put on social media, I put them on Patreon first, as well as some behind the scenes things, a few videos and photos of my tortoise. I'm trying to do Funko Pop Fridays, which is basically me taking photos of a different Funko Pop each Friday. And also there's the Afterthought show, which I release 2 episodes of that each week. So that's around half an hour to 40 minutes of extra content a week there as well. So, that is several hours of content for as little as £2 a month or $3 a month. So if you're willing to spend the amount of money you would spend on a single Starbucks coffee, or like maybe a really cheap burger somewhere, or even a couple of loaves of bread, if you're willing to spend that on entertainment to support this show and also get several hours of additional content each month and behind the scenes and other stuff, go check out patreon.com/genuine chit-chat. I appreciate anyone willing to do that, whether or not you go on there and check out the free stuff, or if you actually contribute. I really, really appreciate that. So guys, that is genuinely enough from me. Thank you so much for listening as always, and I'll talk to you guys next Saturday. Check out all the other amazing shows on the feed of Comics in Motion. There's a different show like every day of the week now, which is amazing. And as always guys, may the Force be with you.